Chapter 21, Hilda Continues Alone. At first, Everett was thinking if it would not be possible to keep Hilda from coming before the commission. Upon consideration, however, he changed his mind and decided not to interfere, but to let the union go through with its program, which had assigned to Hilda a leading part in its testimony. On the afternoon of the third day, she entered the room in which the hearings were held. Everett had not seen Hilda since meeting her at the Savetts' home. The letter he had dispatched to her the following morning. She had had 24 hours to think about it. He had been waiting for her, and as soon as Hilda entered, he walked over and they shook hands. He had hoped for a gaze or a gesture which he could take as an answer to his letter, but there was none. Her greeting was formal. There was no warmth in it. She was polite and restrained. Hilda was pale, and her eyes were tired as if from lack of sleep. It may have been the testimony which she was to give before the commission that had kept her awake, Everett was musing, but it may also have been his letter. He had hoped for a different effect. Two members of the commission approached, and Everett introduced Hilda to them as an acquaintance from the East. One of the commissioners was from New York, and he inquired what organizations she had been associated with there. Hilda named the Waste Workers Union and the Shop Safety Committee. The commissioner, it turned out, knew Dr. Baum of the committee. Of Mr. Raboff he had heard. He at once put Hilda on a basis of equality with himself and the commission. The taking of testimony began. The lawyer for the union was insistent on bringing out Hilda's previous experience and connection with the labor movement in New York. It would add to her prestige and strengthen her testimony. He drew from her the story of the Princess Waste factory fire, the friend she had lost, her own narrow escape, and her subsequent share in the work of making the factories of New York safe. Hilda gave her testimony quietly, adequately, but with reserve, and not too eagerly. She was not striving for effect. She spoke simply, used no invectives, showed no bitterness. She seemed relieved when the personal angle of her testimony was over with, and she came to the part dealing with the situation in Vulcan City, the lives of the miners, the conditions in their homes. She told of the relief work she had been conducting for the miners' organization. She consulted her papers and recited facts and figures. She was on the stand for 3 hours. From time to time, one or another of the commissioners would ask her to repeat certain figures or to recapitulate certain statements. There were no other interruptions. Her testimony was coming down steadily, like a quiet rain, and everyone was listening attentively. Hilda made a conscious effort not to look at Everett. Now and then, however, their eyes met, and each time Hilda bent hers a little lower. She was conscious that Raymond was not listening to her testimony, but to her voice. He was. Hilda's testimony had become to Everett not the story of the miners, of the injustices done to them, but her own story, a recital of the wrongs and injustices, life, no, not life, but he, Raymond Everett, had dealt her. The 10 years in which Hilda had braved the world, not only alone and unaided, but with the crushing handicap of unmarried motherhood weighing her down, lay before him like an open book. the deep, unfathomable grayness in her eyes, which he had noticed the moment he saw her at the Sabbats' home, and which haunted him since, was now clear to him. Death had put it there, the struggle against death and the Princess Fire, the daily struggle against death and disgrace during those 10 terrible years. He was planning to get to her, to speak to her directly the session was over, but could not disengage himself on the instant. When finally he was free, he walked over to the group of miners who had surrounded Hilda as soon as she left the witness chair, but she was not among them. He stepped out into the hall, but there too, she was not to be seen. While searching for her, he came upon Sabbats, and the latter told him that Hilda had gone home. She had barely closed her eyes the night before, and she was tired. He made no attempt to see her that evening, but the following morning, just before the session of the commission opened, they met again. There was a strained, timid expression in Hilda's face as she answered his greeting. He inquired when he might see her. "Can you come Sunday morning?" she asked. She was facing him, but avoided his gaze. Sunday was 2 days off. He had wished to see her sooner, but he agreed on Sunday. Hilda left him, and a moment later Everett saw her in thoughtful conversation with the union's lawyer and with the man who was to be the next witness for the miners. He started for the commissioner's table, dragging his feet heavily. Things were growing misty before his eyes. He had a feeling of having received bad news. He called a little before 9 o'clock, but Hilda was already in the yard waiting for him. Little Raymond came up, greeted Everett shyly, and walked off again. The child's greeting and his hasty departure were prearranged by Hilda. She had told the boy that she wished to spend the morning with Mr. Everett undisturbed. A short distance from the Sabbats' home was country. The valley on one side, the mountains on the other. A few scattered houses were stuck in the mountainside. Past these, a road was winding its way up. Hilda and Raymond Everett were both looking at the road. "Shall we go?" she suggested. He assented hastily. As they were leaving the yard of the Sabbats' home, Everett glanced about for little Raymond, but the child had disappeared. They were walking in silence. The air was as mild and sweet as the breath of a babe. Raymond Everett was on the verge of tears. He was thinking of the past, the years of suffering that lay between him and Hilda. If there were only a way of obliterating these years, if he could but walk with Hilda under the tender Arizona sky as they were once wont to walk, with no clouds between them, no problems to settle, with complete absorption in one another. But that could not be. He and Hilda had been walking side by side for 10 minutes or so, and never once had their shoulders touched. He was gazing at her from time to time. Her face was tense, and from under her tired lashes, her eyes were looking straight ahead of her. The walk distinctly was no pleasure to Hilda. It was an ordeal to her. It was so to him also. If he could but fall at her feet, embrace her knees and weep. But he could not. The past could not be conjured up. Her look, her carriage were too forbidding. She would make him talk, say things. What had he to say? She turned from the main road, and in a short time the town was lost to view. She was apparently familiar with the spot, for she led him up to where there was a large bench-like stone. She sat down and was waiting for him to speak. He finally did. He asked whether she had received his letter. She had. There was a pause, and then he resumed, his voice gaining in firmness as he spoke. He was repeating to her that which he had said in his letter, and more. He was telling her of his vain searchings for her, of the dark and lonely years he had spent, how often he had wished himself dead, had been planning death. But now that he found her, everything must change. It was changed as far as he was concerned. He had already broken with the past. He was taking steps with regard to a divorce. His life henceforward would be devoted to those he loved, to her, to their child. Hilda listened with averted face. What he was saying was exactly what she had been expecting to hear from him the moment she saw him, saw his face, his eyes, his untimely gray hair. It was no surprise to her. His letter had been no surprise, but it was useless. His words, his sentiments, his offers were coming too late. Whatever it was that had separated them 10 years back, a real gulf was between them now. Raymond ceased speaking and was waiting for a word from her. She turned her face upon him. The melancholy grayness in her eyes was deeper than ever. His blood stood still. He was reading his verdict in those eyes. She would never link her life with his. "I know," he was mumbling. "It is hard for you to forget all that you have suffered. It is hard for you to forgive all that I have done to you." "I have forgiven you." Hilda finally broke her silence. "Since I saw you, I have forgiven you. But what you say cannot be." "Why not?" He grasped at her words as a drowning man grasps at a straw. "I don't ask you to unite your life with mine at once. I'll give you time. I can wait until your feelings towards me are once more what they had been, until—" "That will never be," she interrupted him. But Everett pleaded again. "Time, give yourself time." "No, it can't be," Hilda repeated with a deep sigh. "Because I'm not what I was 10 years ago." "Yes, I know," Everett spoke enthusiastically. "You've grown wonderfully. You've made a place for yourself in the world. You are now a—" "Is that the only change you see in me?" She fixed her eyes upon him with an enigmatic look. Into Everett's bloodless features came a puzzled expression. He did not know how to take her gaze. He was pained. Hilda looked up from his face to his gray head and decided to make an end of things as quickly as possible. She was sorry for him. "Raymond," she said, using his Christian name for the first time, "there are more changes in me that can be seen on the surface." She stopped. Now she was having difficulty in explaining herself. Finally, she resumed. "If you had come earlier, I don't know how many years back, but earlier, everything might have been different. Then the life you speak of, love, marriage, a home, might still have had charm for me. Then I was not so much and so definitely at war with the world, with society, with our civilization. It's different now. Now I am lost to that life. I know only two loves now. One is for my child, the other for the rest of the world, for those who suffer in it. I am unfit for family life." "You are not," Raymond cried ardently. "Time—" Hilda motioned to him not to interrupt her. Her speech had come to her only after great effort, and she wished to be over with it. She continued, "For years after you left me, after I left Chicago, I thought of my misfortune only in terms of myself. 'Twas my life that was ruined. My blood was crying for revenge, for justice. 'Twas a personal issue between me and you. But the years have changed this. The wrong done to me has fused itself with the wrongs done to others, millions of others. Millions of working women are wronged and exploited today. They are exploited in factories. They are exploited in shops and offices. They are exploited for their work, and they are exploited for their beauty. There's no reason why I should be the only one to receive compensation, as it were, for my suffering, why my life alone should be sweetened by ease and comfort." "I understand," Raymond spoke up warmly. "You are a socialist. I saw it from your testimony the other day, the way you put things. But I will not interfere with your ideals, with your beliefs. I'll not be a hindrance in your work." As a matter of fact, there was a faint ring of magnanimity in his voice. "As a matter of fact, I'm myself sympathetic with the working people. Very sympathetic. Indeed, I have—" Hilda had averted her face to hide the expression of pain that had come into it. If Raymond had only not made this last remark. Every word of it widened the gulf between them. His phrase, sympathetic with the working people, and the manner in which it was spoken, recalled to Hilda vividly her year in the cooperative apartment with the rich college girls and their dawdling friends. They too spoke with the same benign condescension, used the same vapid jargon. Those men and women too were sympathetic with the working people. It was their stock in trade, this sympathy with the people. It fed their vanity and gave them a sense of being superior. Poor, weak little aristocrats, she mused, as she recalled these acquaintances, and mentally she classed Raymond Everett with them. He was repeating to her about his having no desire to interfere with her beliefs, but Hilda cut him short. "It's not the things I believe in that matter," she said. "It's the things I don't believe in. I don't believe in the life that you propose to me. I am not telling others what they should do or should not do, but I don't believe in it for myself. What you propose is to take me into the class of the privileged, and I am the sworn opponent of this class. I am an enemy of all privileges. The struggle against privileges and the privileged, the war on the present civilization and for a new order of things, fills out my life today as marriage might have filled it out had I not known these ideas, had not injustice, suffering, despair opened my eyes to them." "You mean," Everett was groping for words, "that your ideas, your work in behalf of the masses leaves you no room for marriage or family life?" "Yes," Hilda smiled sadly. "That's how things worked out in my case. I'm a sort of a nun, worshiping in the invisible temple of a new faith." "Hilda!" He had risen from the stone upon which they had been sitting and was standing straight in front of her. "Hilda," he mumbled, "but the child, Don't you want to give him a name? His name? Standing? She jumped up as if a stab had been aimed at her, and she had averted it. He has a name. Her words rang out shrilly and her eyes were flashing. He has a name, my name, and he has standing, the standing of being my son. It may not be a proper standing in the eyes of the law and of society today, but I don't believe in that law and in that society. Neither the one nor the other is founded on right and justice. I despise them both. Name, standing, she continued. The words that you have been using here, the conceptions you have been invoking, belong to the past. By the time my little son is a man, these conceptions will be dead. Woman's right to motherhood will be a question of love, a question to be decided by herself and not by a priest's blessing or by a husband's brute instinct. All life will be sacred. Raymond stood aghast, not at Hilda's words, but at his own helplessness. He was involving himself deeper and deeper and getting more and more away from the point to which he was trying to bring Hilda around. Think of the advantages to the child. He floundered about for something to say. Material advantages, he corrected himself, thinking he was strengthening his plea. I don't want any advantages for him, Hilda spoke stubbornly. Advantages for one imply disadvantages for another. Why should my child have advantages which millions of children of the working class do not have? Advantages for a few 100,000 men, women, and children. Privileges for a limited class. That is the curse of our civilization. It is the rock against which capitalist society will finally be dashed to pieces. It is in order to give advantages to a score or two of sons and daughters of our so-called best families in New York and Boston that the miners in Vulcan City, their wives and children, are kept in a state of semi-servitude. Hilda had completely lost all control over herself. Advantages, she snarled. You have had advantages, and what did you do with them? If you had not had advantages and had not sought more advantages, an advantageous marriage, an advantageous position in society, you would not have left me when you did, and as you did. You loved me then, and you would have married me, and my child would not now be suffering from disadvantages. You would not be trying to atone now for wrongs you should not have committed. Advantages. Don't mention them to me. I don't want them. The sound of her own voice sobered Hilda. She was sorry. She could not understand how she had lost her mastery over herself, her feelings. An outbreak such as this was the one thing she had been guarding against, the one thing she was determined not to let happen. She started back for the city. For some minutes she ran ahead of Raymond. She was trying to compose herself. When she had calmed down, she waited for him to join her and began speaking to him once more, quietly but firmly. As I've told you already, she was saying, I'm harboring no ill will against you, but marriage and family life between you and me are out of the question. I can't think of it now, never. I must go on with my work. It's best for me, for the child. Don't worry about him. I shall raise him to be a good man. I'm glad I saw you, she continued after catching her breath. I've been wanting to see you. I wanted to have things clear between us. They are so now. I'm not interfering with your life, and I want to ask the same of you. Leave us alone. I've told the child certain things concerning his parentage, and I don't want to deviate from them now. I don't want to change them. There's no use beclouding his little head. I've told him that his father is dead. Well, let the myth of death be a reality to him. They were going downhill, and Hilda was walking fast, deliberately. She was all unstrung and wanted to get home and rest. Everett followed her, speechless, dazed. When they reached the corner where she was to turn off to the house, Hilda extended her hand to him. Her eyes were pleading with him to spare her the ordeal of another meeting with the child that day. Raymond cast a sad look at the Savetts' home, which was less than 100 feet away. His eyes filled. He shook her hand and walked away rapidly. The newspapers the following morning announced that the commission would finish its investigation on Tuesday and would leave Vulcan City on Wednesday. Late that afternoon, just as Everett stepped into the hotel, Savetts met him and handed him a note from Hilda. I cannot stand the strain of another meeting, she wrote, and we are leaving town for a few days. Please do not make any efforts to locate us. It is no use. I harbor no ill will against you. Goodbye.